They score! They score!
Welcome to God's Playbook with your host, Father Rico Passero.
Lock at the 20, 10, 5, touchdown! Touchdown!
Let's play ball.
Friends, welcome back to God's Playbook. Today you'll realize with my voice I'm a little bit under the weather, but what's really is exciting today is that I have a special guest with us, Fr.Bill Derousie, a diocesan priest from the Diocese of St. Catharines. Father Bill, welcome to God's Playbook.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Father Bill is here, friends, to talk a little bit about his ministry as a priest, and specifically the special ministry that he had the privilege and pleasure of getting involved in. So, Father Bill, before the listeners hear about your peacekeeping ministry, perhaps we can learn a little bit more about you. I believe you've been a priest now for 42 years?
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your family background, and perhaps the call to priesthood.
Okay. I was born in Millrush, which is a little town that is now underwater near Cornwall, Ontario. It's one of the 7 lost villages. And I was born to a father and a mother, a father who was unilingual English and my mother was unilingual French. And our first language for my older brother, my older sister, and myself was French. That was our first language. And then as we were growing, as the family expanded and we moved from Millrush to Thorold, because that's where there was work for our family, for my father's family. As more children came along, we spoke more English than French, and so as a result, we were educated in the English schools. My father had no religion. My mother was Roman Catholic. And we would often go to my grandparents on the weekends, and those were my mother's parents who were living in Port Colborne. They had moved down from Quebec. And there they spoke French, basically. My father would be busy doing things with my grandfather downstairs with the new house that he had built. And my grandmother and my mother would often talk about wanting a priest in the family. And I can remember very young as a child saying to my grandmother, when I'm older, when I'm bigger and you're smaller, because for me, people got smaller as they got older and bigger as they got older, I'm going to forgive your many sins. And that sort of was the beginning of the idea that I wanted to be a priest.
Interesting.
I was educated in Thorold public schools because my father, not having any Catholicism in his background, ended up not being able to pay the taxes to the separate school board. And as a result of that, he said where he paid his taxes, they would educate his children. He didn't believe in charity on the part of a school board for the education of his children. My parishes, when I first was ordained, were in Niagara Falls and at the jail. I worked at the local regional jail. I worked there for about 7 years before that was given to another person, another priest to do. And that was from the bishop. The bishop had asked that I would visit them on a regular basis, celebrating Mass and hearing confessions for them. And then after that, I was sent to Waynfleet, and a school position came open for religion consultant. So I fulfilled the role of religion consultant for Welland County Catholic School Board until it was amalgamated, and then from 87 to 94. And in 93, while visiting a friend in Cornwall who was the chaplain for all of Ontario, I was asked if I would go to Bosnia because they were short of priests, and because I already had in quite a long military history working with Lincoln and Welland Regiment in St. Catharines. I said to him I would like to do it, but not that particular year. I didn't want to go because I enjoyed what I was doing with the religion consultancy, and I enjoyed the people among whom I was working. So anyway, nothing more ensued until about February. And then February in 94, my friend phoned and said, you're going to Bosnia. And I said, no, I'm not. I told you I'm not going to Bosnia until a few years from now. And he said, no, we need you right now. You've got to go. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. Well, he said, you're the military district commander for the chaplains for Hamilton District, so you would be the natural choice. You're a major. You should go and do that. It'd be good experience behind you. I had done work in Baden-Soligen in 1991 for the summer, and while there, they were planning to invade Kuwait. And I watched them doing the planning on how they would invade into Kuwait to get rid of the Arabs. I saw that. Then I came back home and continued with the religion consultancy. And that was the reason why the chaplain had asked me to go to Bosnia, because I had had that experience and I had been connected with the military for a good number of years.
Okay, so before you went away for this ministry, Father Bill, help us to understand, like, what would be involved in, like, training to be a peacekeeper. What was involved in the preparations before leaving Canada?
Okay, the first thing is you have to understand the military's system. The military is very unlike civilian life. You have to understand the drills. You have to understand the things that would be expected of a soldier in the course of a day. You had to have completed courses. You had to have physical fitness. There were medicals that were done before you would go on to Bosnia or do anything like that. So what they wanted was someone who was rooted in the military sort of system, military way of thinking, and could follow orders, give commands, respect the different ranks, and also at the same time communicate effectively so that the troops would get the message or the commanding officer would get the message, and yet you had to do your ministry as a priest. So celebrating Mass, blessing houses, doing baptisms, anything that you would normally do in a church. But it was expected that that would just become part of your daily routine as a soldier. Getting up at 6 a.m. and doing physical exercises and that kind of a thing. And then maybe gathering around for the sticky buns and coffee at 9:30 in the morning, which would be breakfast. Mm-hmm. Living in barracks, those kinds of things would be what would be expected of anyone that was going on a peacekeeping mission. In other words, really being part of the military experience. So they didn't want new recruits for that. They wanted people that had a little bit of experience behind them so that they would be able to be there for the troops. As chaplains, we had to learn how to do intravenous. We had to know how to bind wounds. We had to have first aid courses down so that if a soldier got injured in any way, we could at least bind them up temporarily until they got to a doctor or to a medic. The other thing that we were expected was that we would be able to carry another soldier on our shoulders with him supporting our back over a distance so that we could get him out of a line of danger if that was possible, if that was a possibility. We had to do route marches, and route marches had to be done within a certain amount of time, carrying all your backpacks and everything, all of your equipment. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that if you got separated from your troops, you could join up with them at a given place and arrive at a certain hour so that they would know that you were coming or expected. We had to learn how to challenge people that came into a camp that was being guarded. Halt, who goes there? The idea was that you were notifying the troops that someone was coming into the camp that shouldn't be there, or maybe that you didn't know. So it was a way of protecting the other troops.
Okay.
How to communicate by radio. using the NATO alphabet. So, and never to say repeat, because that would mean lance some more bombs, which we didn't want to do anyway.
No. So there's a lot involved. I mean,
A lot.
I would have never thought that. Even what you just said about even communication. It's amazing for us to kind of come to understand the background, the training, the preparation, and you haven't even left Canadian soil yet.
No, not at all.
So, Father Bill, maybe you can unpack for us a bit. What did the trip to Bosnia entail?
It entailed leaving my position as a peacekeeper. I left it on June the 26th and was expected to be in Petawawa with all of my equipment, and everything moved out of my apartment over at St. Thomas More Church in Niagara Falls. Within a weekend, everything had been moved and put into storage, and I was on my way to Bosnia with everything that I had that was military. And then from there, it entailed 3 months of intensive learning. 3 months learning some of the Serbo-Croat language. Putting up with really, really difficult situations where you would be out in the field for a weekend, and it would be like you were in Bosnia with bullets maybe firing over your head, or learning how to fire from like I can't remember the name of the gun that we would use. It wasn't a gun, it was a machine and lob shells into barrels down like 250 yards down the field, so that you were hitting them, assembling and disassembling rifles, and making sure that you knew how to disengage a rifle in case there was an area of danger.
Okay.
Meeting people who were playing Serbs or Croats and complaining, and how you would deal with the complaints, either with a sense of humor or through an interpreter, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Learning just very basic things that you had already covered in your training as a military padre, but at the same time making sure that where a social worker wasn't available, you would be able to do something to help people with PTSD. Usually the style used in the military was walk and talk. So if somebody had a bad experience, the idea was the chaplain would actually walk with them and talk with them and let them talk out some of the things that they were thinking about. I think that's a good beginning anyway.
So it's interesting for us to realize that you're not just dealing with their own spiritual needs, but a lot of times the chaplain's also responsible for their physical, emotional, psychological, etc.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's very fair. The other thing, too, is that as military chaplains, if there were deaths or if there was an accident or anything like that, we were expected to maintain family contact, to notify the family, to inform them as to what was being done, so that they would have a face or a name that would go with them. And then the other thing that we were expected was that we would always work through the commanding officer or the head of the orderly room. And the idea there was that we were maintaining communication between the troops and the other officers. An interesting thing that I had to do was I was always considered one rank above the person to whom I was speaking. So if you were speaking to a corporal, they were speaking to a sergeant. If you were speaking to the lieutenant colonel, you were speaking to a full colonel. Okay. And the idea was that we were not ordering anything. We didn't give orders. What we did was that we were speaking to them in areas of advice or consultation.
Okay. So help us to kind of get a sense. So you had this very intense training in multiple ways that you were so kind to share with us, and perhaps many other ways as well. So now you're on your way to Bosnia. Talk to us about how you felt, the journey, the first days there, your adjustment. Help us to get in the head of Father Bill and seeing how this new ministry for you was going to take off.
Okay. So before we left, I left in October of 1994. And before I left, I was given a week off to go home and be with family or other people. Now, my mother and father having been dead at that point, I went over to visit with a brother, and then I took a sister to Florida. And then we came back, and I got on the plane to go to Bosnia. It was a regular civilian plane, 747. The troops went in 3 stages, so our whole battalion went in 3 stages. The RCD, the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and we arrived in Italy, in Rome, took a bus from Rome over to Split, over to Ancona, and from Ancona took a boat to Split. And so that was 1 day's journey. And the overnight was on the boat between Ancona and Split in Yugoslavia. And then when we arrived in Split, we were bused to the local area of transportation, Combat 1. And Combat just means Canadian Battalion, the 1st Canadian Battalion, and that was on the coast of Croatia. We got on our buses, and we took a 12-hour drive across different communities down along the Croatian coast, which was beautiful to see. But as we started going inland toward Bosnia, where Combat 2 was located, near Visoko, what we found was that we were coming across bridges that had been bombed out, historic land sites that had been destroyed. The bus was stopped at one point, and we were all told to put on our flak jackets, our helmets, and we were to ride the rest of the way in gear that would protect us from bullets, basically. We went across, and we came into the mountains, and then we began seeing areas that were cleansed. And by cleansed, what would often happen is if a village was predominantly Croatian and there were Bosnians or Serbs in there, they would attack the house, set it on fire, and get rid of the family. Or depending upon what the majority group was. In some cases, tombstones were effaced or defaced, and the idea was to remove any mark that group of people ever lived in that area. So the idea is to deny the fact that these people were people in many ways. We went through a couple places where there were stories that were told, nothing very nice. And we arrived late in the evening, around 7:30, after beginning 7 in the morning, to arrive at Combat 2.
Wow.
And I didn't know what to expect. We arrived at a large factory. It was an old cement factory that was taken over by the peacekeeping units, the Canadian peacekeeping unit, and we had certain floors in those buildings. I was near the chapel. The chapel was it was inside a cement building, but it was a tent inside a cement building. So you had a cement floor, and then you had a tent over your head, and you slept there. And all the areas had tents over where the people were sleeping to keep the dust down, for one reason. And then the other thing was for protection against the elements, because remember, there are no windows in any of these. There were window frames, but they were empty. There were no windows, no glass. So I moved into the chapel.
Father Bill, maybe share with us what one would do in the camp, perhaps some of your chaplain peacekeeping duties on a regular basis. Give us some sense of what, I don't want to call it a normal day might look like, but as a peacekeeping chaplain, what were some of the responsibilities you would have on a daily basis?
Okay, on a daily basis, I'd always celebrate Mass, but it wouldn't always be in the camp. We had several outposts, or OP, observation posts, and OPs were located in areas where we were separating the Serbians from the Bosnians, the Serbians from the Croats from the Bosnians, and the Croats from the Serbs. So because these were the warring parties, Croatia was breaking away. It had broken away, but they wanted to take some of the areas of Bosnia with them. The Serbs wanted to keep everything intact, and the Bosnians wanted nothing to do with the other two. So we were on many fronts. We were 15 kilometers from Sarajevo, and we were actually, one of our buildings was one of the former Olympic hotels that were being used. So what I would do, usually we got up at 6 a.m, we would shower, have breakfast, then go to the commander's first briefing. So what we did at the briefing during the day is we would hear all of the reports from all the observation posts as to what had happened either the last day or the last couple of days. And then we would be determining what we should be watching out for. So around Christmas, one of the things that we knew was that there would be, within the Croatian communities, because of midnight mass and mass times, people moving around midnight or things like that. So they would expect to see that. But they wouldn't expect to see a Serbian in a tractor pulling bombs up the slope of a mountain to lance toward another person. Other things that we would talk about would be what the charitable things that were happening around the camp. So some of our soldiers were going into the local asylum. And I say asylum because it was people that were really mentally ill. And it was run by a lady who wanted the Communist Party back in charge. And what they did in there was they were cleaning out the asylum. Like there were, when we went into the kitchen, there were cockroaches all over the pipes. And on the stoves where they were cooking, there were cockroaches climbing across the ceilings and things like that above it. And so what they were trying to do is get rid of the cockroach population in there. Some of the population were mentally ill, or they were seriously deformed because of birth defects and things like that. And people didn't want to keep them, so they were given a place to lodge there. And in some cases, there were children living in that institution because they were orphans and there was no place for the children. And so we were sort of looking at how we could make their living conditions more amenable, more comfortable for them. And then other things that we did, one time I went in the afternoon and I spent the night in a tent watching over a cannon to make sure that no one was going to use that to bomb Sarajevo. So we were in the middle of a field beside a tank and a cannon. Wow. And we were keeping an eye on that all night to make sure that nothing was being used to conduct war. Peacekeeping is rather interesting. We made reports. I can remember one observation post where I was. We were on the side of a mountain overlooking Sarajevo, which was about 10 miles in the distance. And all night it looked like there were fireworks going off. And it was actually people bombing the city of Sarajevo. And if people remember, Sarajevo was a place where they turned trucks on their sides so that people had a walkway that they could walk and not be fired on by people who were watching at that time. Another time, I went up a mountain, and what I often did when I went up the mountains is I would always bring them fresh baked goods. So, because I didn't have to carry a rifle or anything like that, I didn't have a rifle. I would have my mass kit. Well, my arms could carry other things. So we walked up a mountain to an observation post in another part on the Serbian side. And what I did was I brought them hot sticky buns and other things like that would be fresh for them that morning. And when we arrived at the observation post, we would sit with them and talk about what had happened over the night previous. Quite often, many of the combatants would go up slopes at night carrying things that they would be bombing others with later in the day. And so the reports were made about that. But again, all we did was write reports. We couldn't get involved in those kinds of things.
Okay. Father Bill, this, I don't know if this is true of you friends who are listeners, but right now my mind is blown as to just some of these experiences that Father Bill is sharing with us. Father Bill, maybe you could speak about, were you ever afraid? Did you just feel the protection of God? Did you feel at times that, why did the Lord call you to do this? Maybe you can share a little bit about your feelings in this regard.
That's a good question. When I arrived at Combat 2, one of the things that I did, there was a lot of Eucharist that was left over. I don't know what the chaplain had done before me, but a lot of the Eucharist had been left in a place that I wasn't sure if they were consecrated or not. So one of the things I did is I went to where the mud pits were, because when you have Eucharist, you either bury it or soak it in water and then throw that into the dirt, so that the Eucharist is not in any way desecrated. You don't want to desecrate. So what I did was I put it into a really deep mud pit, and then I found out that's where the tanks were running over the mud pit. So anyway, I buried all the Eucharist there so that it wouldn't be desecrated in any way. And that for me was a really odd thing to do. The other thing I did was I prayed that none of our troops would be in any accidents, or that no one of our troop would be killed while on duty, because previous peacekeepers had been killed or had been hurt. The other thing that I did was I moved into where my accommodations were next to the chapel, and when the Protestant chaplain came, he stayed a week and was not happy with the conditions and demanded to return to Petawawa. So I ended up being the only chaplain at Combat 2 from October until Christmas Eve.
Oh.
So I was responsible for all of the religious duties for all the troops, Protestant and Catholic. So that involved on Sundays making sure that the Protestants had a way that they could come together in the same chapel that we prayed in as Catholics, and have their service and have the ministrations of a priest. The other thing, I always felt safe until, and it was the first Sunday of December. It was the first Sunday of Advent, and I got up one morning at about 4 o'clock, and I just couldn't stay in the chapel, in my place near the chapel. I just didn't feel comfortable there. So I got up and started walking around the factory looking at all of the different things that were available. And while I was gone, the Serbs decided to lance bombs against our camp. They hit, I think they lanced 4 bombs, 3 certainly. They were 125 millimeters thick. They pierced the concrete, and the shrapnel flew throughout the camp. None of our soldiers were hurt.
Thank God.
And then the other thing is a piece of shrapnel was on my bed when I returned to the chapel after the bombing had been done.
Wow.
The Serbs had taken a group of our battalion into hostage. So they were being housed in local Serbian houses, but we were not allowed on the Serbian side. And then I had to notify some of the families that their people were taken captive.
Wow.
No one was hurt, which I was really thankful for. They began deciding they were trying to determine who were essential personnel that must remain in the camp, and others were going to be sent 17 kilometers away in another building, an old hotel that was from the Olympics, in another community that would be safer. I was determined to be non-essential until I spoke with the commanding officer and said if he wanted me to be notifying people of their families' well-being, I had to be central to the camp. I couldn't be 17 kilometers away and not being where I was needed when I was needed. He agreed, and so I was declared essential personnel. For the next 3 weeks, our troops were held hostage by the Bosnians, and occasionally we were allowed to go and see them. But I can tell you that for about 2 months following that, at least 3 personnel needed to walk and talk quite often because of their experiences when they were taken. The only time I really, really felt that I wasn't too smart was I had taken a sweater that my mother had knit when I was a teenager, and it was a white sweater, and I was moving about the camp at night, perfect object for a bullet, but it never happened. But it dawned on me that, I had to be a little bit more cautious about what I was doing.
Right.
Other than that, I never felt danger in any way that way.
Amazing that despite all the violence, the danger around you, you felt safe. Amazing to really think about that. But again, if God is bringing you here to do this peacekeeping work, perhaps he would save you from that fear.
He not only saved, there was an experience that I often think of. There were 2 experiences that really struck me as being odd. Christmas night. On Christmas Day, there was, we as chaplains served other contingents. Like we had the Dutch that were living with us. We had the Belgians the Belgian police were among our battalion in the camp at 2. We had some French people. We had the pilots that were flying into into Visoko. And so quite often as a priest, I would serve those people. But what had happened was about a week before Christmas, a high school in Vancouver sent Christmas gifts for everybody in the camp. They were little things, but they were things that people would need. And I thought it was really, really appropriate that somebody from the other side of Canada cared enough that they would send gifts, and they were wrapped. And so quite often I was out giving gifts because the chaplains were expected to distribute some of these gifts out to the troops. When we were distributing them, we didn't know really what we were giving them. But we did anyway. And I can remember Christmas night. I had been in Visoko and I had celebrated Mass in the camp, the main camp. And then I went to the other one, and some of the people came to Mass. The soldiers were really faithful. They prayed, and that was something that I really appreciated. Mm-hmm. We had really faithful people, both religion, Protestant and Catholic, who did pray. Soldiers do pray. And a lot of people say you only pray when you're in a foxhole. That isn't true. They pray. They have a good faith, a lot of them. What I did notice was the ones that came to the Mass in the evening on Christmas Day were the ones that were coming in from the observation posts. Then, at night, the pilots were invited. The pilots were the ones that flew the helicopters that brought the ones that were injured to the hospitals, or they were the ones that would take them. The helicopters would fly them to other combats or to other battalions so that they would get more prompt medical aid. Anyway, one French pilot came to Mass, and I debated whether to celebrate Mass for one person, But then I thought, no, he came. He was expecting. I'm going to celebrate Mass. So I celebrated Mass for him in French. And at the end of the Mass, I gave him a little gift. And he opened it in front of me, and it was a plane. I thought, well, this is appropriate. It's a pilot. It's a plane.
Yes.
And then he said to me that his son had been born the day before, and he had no gift for his son. Now he did.
How special is that? Wow.
And I thought, God works in strange ways.
He sure does. Father Bill, perhaps giving us some insight into one of the most memorable or influential moments in your ministry in peacekeeping in Bosnia, perhaps a conversation, an event. Help us to know maybe one or two of the major highlights for you, though the latest story, I presume, would always be on your heart. But
I can remember that we were delivering coffins to Sarajevo. And the trip would have taken 15 minutes down the highway from where we were. It was a 4-lane highway. If we could get permission to go across the border into Serbia from our side and then go down the highway, deliver the coffins, and return. It would have been half a day at most. What ended up happening was the Serbs said no. They would not let us use the highway. So we had to go up to Sarajevo on an 8-hour trip through the mountains. The snow was as high as this room, so it was about 16 feet along the side of the road. Sheer drops, ice, and we got into Sarajevo, and as we were arriving in Sarajevo, there were bullets flying around us at the trucks. But we got in, we stayed overnight, and then we came back the next day. And again, we had to go back through the mountains. So that was a wasted, they needed the coffins for the people that were killed in Sarajevo so that they could do body exchanges. And it was to the Serbians' advantage. It was to everyone's advantage, and they said, no, you can't do that. Another experience that I'll never forget. It was February. No, it was January, late January, and we were. I was going up to visit an observation post, and as I pulled into the observation post, they met me at the soldiers. Our soldiers met me at the door and said, "You can't come in this door, Padre. They're having a meeting. Come around the other side of the OP." So I walked around the other side of the OP. They knew I was there for Mass, so they had things sort of set, like a table set up for me. And we started celebrating Mass. But as I was beginning to unpack everything, I could hear yelling and shouting on the other side of the wall in the OP. And I thought, this really isn't the setting for a Mass, but this is life. I mean, you do what you can for the troops when you can do it. So we started celebrating Mass. And as we celebrated Mass, there was a calm that came over the whole OP. And when I say a calm, it was like, I really can't explain it. There was no shouting, there was no yelling, and then just before communion, one of the people came from the other side of the OP, like through a door, and came into where we were, and he sat down and celebrated the rest of the Mass with us. And then toward the end of the Mass, when I was about to leave, the interpreter came in. And the gentleman said to me, the man that had joined us from the other side said to me, "We were bound and determined that no road would be opened throughout Bosnia in this area until certain conditions were met." Each of the parties, the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnians, had decided that they weren't going to let the other cross. And during the Mass, for some reason, they couldn't explain it. They all came to the agreement that they would open all the roads. and bring peace to that area.
The power of prayer.
And I really believe it is a power of prayer. I
Wow.
believe that.
Wow. Very memorable moments indeed. Father Bill, as we come to a conclusion about your ministry in Bosnia, maybe helping us to understand your transition from that powerful ministry back into Canadian soil and, resuming your parish ministry, how that was for you. Was it an easy transition? Was it difficult? Tell us about that.
A lot of the soldiers found the transition from Bosnia back home very difficult. One reason is because the wives had taken over a lot of the things that the men would do. So going back home, the men would feel that their wives were now more independent, more, and they weren't against the idea, they just weren't used to it. So the marriage and sometimes the absenteeism really added to the estrangement between husbands and wives. So that was one thing that they had to think about. The other thing is, I can remember going into a restaurant and wanting to sit with my back to the wall so I could see what was happening on the outside of the building. Because I'd been, for the last 6 months, facing the fact that anytime you were in a building, you always had to know what your surroundings were. And that took a long time to get used to, that in Canada you don't have to do that.
Yes.
Walking across open fields. Mines were a common thing in Bosnia. So you didn't walk across open fields. And so an open field sometimes would bring you back to that sort of mentality or that sort of idea.
Yes.
When I talked to you about bringing baked goods up the mountainside, we had to walk in each other's footsteps. So the person ahead of you walked, and then you waited and you copied his footsteps, like you walked in his footsteps. Because if he hit a mine, well, then you aren't going to walk in that mine. But if his footsteps were secure, yours would be secure. And, that's a little thing. I was still to be with the military for an extra year. In other words, I went on to study, do some studies in Quebec for a while. And then I came back as a priest full time. But I also worked on some of the other bases while I was fulfilling that year, like North Bay. Other things that were, I know a lot of people that come back from peacekeeping are angry. And they're angry for the simple reason they've gone to do what they think are good things. For example, we saved a pregnant lady who was in a breech birth, got her to the hospital on time, and saved ourselves from going down the mountainside in a cougar because the ground was too wet. And thank God the driver of the cougar, it's like a tank, a cougar, had the presence of mind to drop the tailgate, and it wedged us into the mountainside. Many times the troops go there to do things to bring an end to hostilities, and their hands are tied. Mm-hmm. Because all you can do is write a report, and maybe nothing will be done about the situation that you reported, or nothing can be done. Sometimes the people returning are angry, not because of anything in particular. It's just they've gone through a time of anger, and they've got to get back into a time of peace. And one thing, if there's one thing that I've learned in traveling a lot, and I do a lot of traveling, when you go into areas that were torn by war or subjected to war, quite often the mentality is, your father did this to my father, it is my duty now to get even. And there's no forgiveness. And I think that's the hardest thing for troops to confront, that there is no forgiveness. So when you return to a place where forgiveness, like in Canada, how many times do you hear the word sorry in a day?
It's true.
And what does it mean?
It's a very different world, isn't it?
It is very
the
different.
culture is
Yeah.
dictating that.
And so we have to get back into the swing of things, the way that we do things that respect people. And I think that, that whole idea that we're built in the image and likeness of God is such a powerful thing if you use that to bring yourself into a realization that you are in a country of peace or a country that values other people. I think that might be a good answer for you. I don't know.
Father Bill, I think the listeners would want to ask this question. If given the opportunity to do peacekeeping ministry again, would you do it?
At my age, I wouldn't ever be asked to do it. But if they said to me they needed a peacekeeper anywhere in the world, I would go again, immediately.
God bless you. That's powerful
Yeah.
to say that.
I think it's important to bring God to the situations that are in war. And I really feel that in Bosnia, that's something that we did do, that we saw the presence of God. We knew that God was present with us, bringing the peace. So,
Father Bill, what a beautiful gift it's been for us listeners to hear just some of your stories of your powerful ministry and how God used you in so many different ways in your priestly ministry over these 42 years, but specifically in regards to your time in Bosnia. Perhaps I can ask you to lead us in a prayer in praying for peace for the world and peace for those priests and those who are lay people who are currently chaplains for our armed forces, perhaps praying for our soldiers. And Father Bill, would you be so kind to lead us in prayer at this time?
let us pray. God of mercy and reconciliation, open our hearts to love God and to love our neighbor as Jesus taught us. May we bring peace to others by our willingness to forgive, to reconcile, and to live this love of you, God, and of our neighbor, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Father Bill, thank you for spending this time with us. We are truly blessed by your priestly ministry here in the Diocese of St. Catherine's, to which you have so faithfully served for so long, but also for giving us a sneak peek of one of the other beautiful things that priests do, especially as chaplain for our armed forces. So God bless you, and we hope to have you again back at God's Playbook.
Thank you.
Friends, for God's Playbook, I'm Father Rico. God loves you, and so do I.
If you like what you hear, please consider supporting us using any of our affiliate links in the description below via Buzzsprout, Ko-Fi, or GoFundMe. Thanks, and God bless.